We are now approaching a session which I think will again bring us even closer to some perspective that is sometimes called the activists or the practitioners' perspective. And the idea is actually that Rachel Witkin, who is going to present now, will be introduced by Friedrich Regner, and I'm not sure whether he's already.
Yeah,
okay.
So.
Yeah. So I hand over to Friedrich Regner from Aktionsnetzes Heilberufe, Amnesty International, who helped us establishing this contact, and who is going to introduce Rachel and her work.
Sorry, can I just
Is there a technical? Sorry, what's wrong?
Start this, please.
We need to start the presentation.
Instruction. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. So, hello. My name is Friedrich Regner. I'm a psychologist, and I belong to the Health Professional Network of Amnesty International Germany. I have the pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who is Mrs. Rachel Witkin of the Helen-Bamber-Foundation in London. The Helen-Bamber-Foundation offers help to survivors of extreme human cruelty, such as torture survivors or victims of human trafficking. And Rachel is the lead of the counter-trafficking unit of the organization. Our Amnesty Network has invited Rachel to this conference, and we are grateful to the organizers to have had the opportunity to do so, as we think that Helen Bamber herself, who died last year at the age of 89 after almost 70 years of dedicating her life to the right to health, has made an enormous contribution to the right to health internationally. She was a co-founder of Amnesty International in the 60s. She founded the medical group of Amnesty in the 70s. In the 80s, she founded the Medical Foundation for Torture Victims in London. And finally, she founded the Helen-Bamber-Foundation in 2005, whose director she was until last year. Rachel, in her talk, will focus on Helen's approach, which she named creative survival, and she will especially focus on the aspect of therapists being advocates for their clients. That means they're not only supposed to treat and heal them, but also to empower them in claiming their rights. So far, my short introduction, and now I'd like to pass over to Rachel Witkin.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, this came about because Friedrich Regner approached the Helen-Bamber-Foundation with a very interesting interview that he did with Helen Bamber in 2002. And we collaborated to organize that material and edit it as a paper, staying true to Helen's own words. And Friedrich has titled it The Therapist as Advocate, in keeping with Helen Bamber's approach. So that's how this came about. What I wanted to do was, I'm aware that not much is written about Helen Bamber, despite her incredible life. There's quite a lot about her human rights work, but she was a very dedicated practitioner. She spent every day in her office seeing clients, and so the interview that's been provided to us is a really useful bit of information about her daily work, which is what I and all her other colleagues witnessed over the years. Okay, so hopefully this works. Okay, so this is Helen. This is Helen as I knew her. Obviously, she's had many faces over the years since she began her career in 1945, when she entered the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen as with one of the first rehabilitation and relief teams to work with survivors. And there she basically, I think, formed all of her knowledge about the complexity of human rights violations, because obviously she was dealing with torture and terrible crisis and atrocity, but she was also dealing with forced labor and slavery, which is something that we work on very strongly at the Foundation. In 1961, she, after working with children from concentration camps who were brought to the UK, particularly from Auschwitz, She then helped to establish and became chair of the first medical group of the British section of Amnesty International, where she originally worked very strongly on Chile, which is something I'm going to talk about further on. In 1985, she founded the Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture, which was solely dedicated to health and human rights and documenting the torture of individual refugees, asylum seekers, and other exiles who had suffered torture in their own countries. And then in 2005, she founded the Helen-Bamber-Foundation, taking quite a lot of her crew with her, but also adding new life, new colleagues, and Helen always worked in a very collaborative way with organisations everywhere who were working to further human rights. And I should mention at this stage that although we have a very worldwide perspective, we work in the UK system, which, as many of you will know, is extremely tricky when it comes to the legal rights of refugees. There are very complex adversarial systems for them to go through, so that's what we work with all the time. So being an advocate is a very certain thing in the context we're working in. So basically, that's Helen when she was young, and this is the memorial that we had in London just about the time that Freiheit sent us the paper, and it was a very well-attended memorial. This up here is on our wall. It's the history of Helen as she goes through from 1945, although actually I realised recently that she started before then when she was a teenager fighting the fascists under Oswald Mosley in the UK, so she was always a real advocate for human rights, even before she went to Bergen-Belsen. Then I thought about reading you a list of all the atrocities, countries and survivors that have happened between 1945 and 2013-14, which is when she was forced to end her work. And I just realised that it would take all day. So we all know them. You know, there are so many terrible things that have happened. She's worked with survivors from everywhere from Ireland to Soviet Union, Chile, Vietnam, Syria, Russia, you know, oh gosh, it just goes on and on. Many countries in Africa, you know, there are so many. We work with people from all over the world who are refugees in the UK. So at her memorial, this was Ben Helfgott, who was one of 732 child survivors of the Holocaust that Helen supported to come to the UK. There were actually space for 1,000 to come, but they couldn't fill the spaces because there weren't enough survivors for that project. He was a child in Auschwitz, and he spoke very movingly at the memorial, saying that the little that was left of our civilized life was completely stripped. We had literally been reduced to the animal level. And he talks there about Helen finding accommodation, which is very Helen because she's very practical, and all of this issue about being an advocate is about welfare, housing, survival, being comfortable, being able to eat, not being destitute, and that's the whole core of her work. So she started this very early on. This is a survivor called Perico Rodriguez, who we often see at the foundation, actually, because most people are friends of the foundation after this length of time. He talks about being issued with an Amnesty medical urgent action in 1979 that actually he credits with saving him from being killed and tortured further. He'd been imprisoned for 3 years under the Chilean regime, and he talks about Helen going and demanding where are the prisoners at the Argentinian embassy in London. And he also says, you know, she was just doing what she thought anyone should do. But the Chilean work that she did, I'm actually going to read a bit of that to you from the paper that we've produced. I wanted to mention as well the survivors and violations that are less visible, because when you do have that big impressive wall chart talking about, you know, all the crises and atrocities that happened, you forget that at the time, well, I know you don't forget, but people generally forget that at the time those were not popular causes. They were causes that maybe weren't believed and weren't understood, or people just didn't care, and then later they became important. And I think what's most important to me about Helen is her lack of distinction about what's appropriate or what other people think are the most important causes. And I know, because I met her and started working with her in 1998, that she was already working on causes that have much more recently become documented. For example, she was working on trafficking cases, which were complex and people barely could believe it at that point in the legal system. She was working with FGM, female genital mutilation cases, which weren't, they weren't something that was really understood as a problem at that time. She's always worked with people who have suffered gender identity violence and violence because of their sexuality, and that, as we all know, has not been something that has been easy to work on for many of the years that she was working. So she's always championed cross-cutting causes. And this is from somebody who, this is a very typical case where a man came to the UK and got this response to his asylum claim. It was totally disbelieved. He had no food, nothing. It was all stopped. Didn't have a place to sleep. Ends up working illegally, and he's given an 8-month prison term. And then after prison, he spent another year in indefinite detention, where you don't know when you're coming out because it's under immigration laws, in a detention centre in the UK. And then by that time, he was just at the end of his wits and the end of his rope. He's a really lovely guy, actually. That's him up there. But he spoke at the memorial really movingly, and he said how difficult it is to talk about the torture that he'd undergone. And I haven't actually included that here because I'm not sure he would like that, but he did actually include that when he talked about it. And this woman here, she's a victim of trafficking who's one of the very, very, very few to put her face to a photograph and actually talk about her experience. And this has been a big thing for her. She's done it in our creative arts programme. And you will find the photographs of that exhibition and the writing on the web. And, there was a victim of trafficking who stood up at the memorial and talked about being sold and sold and sold again to different traffickers and how much money was paid. And I can't use her image, I can't use her words because she wouldn't give permission for that. So often with women's cases, we work an enormous amount on women, but it's very difficult often to sort of be able to use their image and to get that across. So if you're interested in those photographs, do look at that. That's an exhibition we did with Voice of Freedom. Okay, I'm not going to go into juju trafficking. I don't know how many people know about it, but this is just one example of the kind of work that Helen was doing way before people really understood about juju trafficking ceremonies, which we work on with Nigerian clients who have been subjected to these ritual ceremonies as a way of maintaining their silence as victims of trafficking, so that telling the police or telling anybody or escaping or anything is absolutely terrifying, on top of all the other fears that they may have. So this is a case that we published, so I'm allowed to use this, and this is a very typical sort of ceremony that we often work with, and quite a lot of our clients from Nigeria have unfortunately been through. There are some men as well who've been through this. And then, this is Helen talking in a report that we wrote, where she's talking from experience of working with these kind of complex issues like juju trafficking and how she approaches it. And the reason I chose just to highlight this is just because it's so sensible and practical, and it comes from just lots of experience. I think when the juju ceremonies became known to the legal sector and to other practitioners, there was a sort of worry about disturbing existing beliefs, and she just had a very practical way of approaching everybody and explaining things to them, which I think is just really helpful to me in my daily work and to the colleagues that now work at the foundation. So I wanted to move on to the paper, which is The Therapist as Advocate, which is Freiheit came to us with the paper. As I said, if you really want to know about Helen's work and how she worked in her daily life, which was everything to her, she was a very intuitive person who worked deeply with people, and that was her thing. And she worked with the people who worked with people. So when it came to doing conferences and advocating for human rights, she did it. But when it came to discussing the work, there isn't enough, I feel there isn't enough about her, and I like to learn more, and I think that Freihardt getting this interview was really helpful. What you can't do, but I can do because I work there, is to read the medical reports, the many, many medical reports and documents that she wrote in her lifetime on behalf of asylum seekers. I call them refugees, but technically they're seeking asylum, but I don't like that term, so I tend to say refugees, but I hope that doesn't cause any confusion, because in the UK you're a refugee when you get legal status, but anyway. So she has intricate documentation on all of the clients that she worked with. It's a really important part of our work, medical legal documentation. It's particularly important to the legal system that we're in, because it often changes the situation when people are claiming to have been tortured or tortured within other scenarios such as trafficking, collective violence, war, gender-based violence, all of these issues. And it often changes the scenario for them because professional physicians, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists are documenting the history of what's happened to this person. So medical reports are used a lot in the UK. And when I read her medical reports, I'm always taken with the level of detail into each and every person. It's very interesting. But when it comes to publishing that information, of course, that's not possible in most cases. So with the interview, I'm just going to flip through a few things that it covered. I know you're keeping an eye on my time, aren't you? Okay. So understanding the sense of injustice with survivors of human rights violations is part of the therapeutic process for Helen. She also discusses in the paper the complexity and the difficulty of the role of the therapist as advocate. It's not an easy role, and it's not one that is easily approached by any of us. We all cross over our roles. So I'm more advocate than therapist. I'm not actually a therapist, but I have to work in a therapeutic environment, and I apply therapeutic principles to my own work. So we're all aware of each other's work. Therapists are aware of legal work and of other forms of therapy, etc. So just to cover what we talked about in this, well, what Helen told Freihardt about in this interview, she discusses the sense of injustice which is experienced by people who are politically traumatized. This sense of injustice originates in the home country, but it can be continued and compounded in host countries where safety is sought due to a political climate of denial against refugees. The author reflects on her therapeutic work with people who have suffered interpersonal violence and exile from political persecution, emphasizing the importance of acknowledging their experiences through careful documentation. She explains how the 1998 arrest in London of Chilean dictator Pinochet became the focal point for a group therapy process for Chilean survivors that she worked with. She uses this and other case examples to clarify the meaning of the role of the therapist as an advocate. As well as consideration of the political realm, Helen believes it is equally important to acknowledge the sense of injustice which may originate from much earlier, from within the family, the community, and the culture. She explains how addressing this in therapy with clients in practical ways can be an empowering process, affecting gradual and progressive change in their lives and the lives of their children. She says, "I'm talking about the therapist as an advocate, not solely as a therapist. When a person sees that the therapist is part of their search for justice and not simply working with their internal world, a different relationship is formed between them. As therapists who work with survivors of human rights violations, we are operating within a political arena, so I think it is important that we declare this through our work and the documentation of our survivors' experiences." This is Helen's approach to care, and care for us is a very long-term thing, but it actually helps people to thrive and make independent lives. She says, "Survivors present to us with many physical and practical problems. We will take up the practical and legal issues of a client's case, as well as looking at the clinical treatment that they need. You cannot begin to treat a person appropriately if they are desperately concerned about their future, about the past, and about the present. And I really like the way that quote is taken directly from the interview, because it shows the jumbled nature of time and chronology for people who are on the wrong side of borders and in the wrong place and time when it comes to human rights violations. All of these things can come up, issues at different times, as we know, and set back the process of recovery, as well as propelling it forward. So we have a very long period of monitoring and evaluation which goes along as people recover. Documentation is really important. As I said, we have a medical legal documentation team which is made up of our medical experts, and what Helen says about that is that the documentation of suffering by doctors, therapists and others, whether there are physical signs or not, acknowledges and validates survivors' experiences. She thinks this is an essential part of the therapeutic process. It can support a person's claim for asylum, and it becomes a historical document which could, and in this case that I'm going to share with you actually did, bring perpetrators, let's say, towards justice. So, when she's talking about justice, Helen says, I think, as therapists working in Europe with people who have been tortured, abused, who have been victims, misused as slaves, we are ourselves working in such an atmosphere of injustice towards our clients. I mean the injustice of the rhetoric that is used politically and publicly against them. The asylum legislation that becomes more and more punitive, or as she describes it elsewhere, Kafkaesque in its bureaucracy. The harsh decisions to send people back to their countries when we know perfectly well that they are likely to be tortured or disappeared when they return. So the question of justice applies to us as much as it does to the client, and it forces us into the role of being an advocate for them. So it is irritating, she says, because it brings out the advocate in us, the sense of the injustice on behalf of the client and on behalf of ourselves. She goes on to talk about, there is a number of things she talks about in this interview which I find interesting. We had to find a way of organising it in a Helen way so that it sounded like her. And I was saying to Freihardt, she actually has a very Germanic sentence structure, I think, which is difficult for me as a monolingual English editor. But she speaks very broadly about people so that when she's talking about the various trauma they suffer, or the various injustices they've been through, or the various needs they have, they sort of all come together in a way that's really quite poetic. For this, we separated it out to look at it more as an approach so that it could work perhaps a little more as a lecture or a guide, or you know, be a little bit more accessible. And one of the most interesting things, I think, is perhaps one of the most unusual cases where actually all of that documentation on a particular group of survivors came to have real depth and meaning in the political and legal structure in the UK and internationally. She told Freihardt, I'm working with a group of middle-aged Chileans who took part in the political struggle against Pinochet's regime in the 1970s. They lost that struggle, they were tortured, and some of their relatives were disappeared. And what we don't mention in the paper is the level, of course, of the horrors of the torture, which can sometimes get in the way of text, but it's very important to remember that people were physically very disabled in some cases and had had terrible psychological scarring and injury from this experience. When they arrived in the UK, we documented their cases at the medical group of Amnesty International. I'd been working on Chile for Amnesty International at that time. When Pinochet was arrested in London in 1998, they had been living in the UK for over 20 years, and I had begun to work with them once again, but this time as a therapist. Many had been university students or trade union leaders in Chile, but they had not found a rightful place for their skills in our society. They said they wanted me to run a group for them because they were finding it difficult. They still had one foot in Chile, one foot in this country. Their children did not always understand what had happened and why they had come to the UK. When I first went to their centre in the north of England, they had sat me down at a table with a pen and pencil, Everyone had bits of paper and it was like a trade union or a political meeting. I went along with this and I didn't change it. We just talked about what was worrying them. So I think the group I ran at the start was a mixture of a political meeting and a therapeutic group, although they never saw themselves as a therapeutic group at first. They just wanted an understanding of how to go forward. For years, they had crushed and submerged a great deal of their longing for justice. They had not acknowledged it. They didn't know it existed anymore. They were struggling in a fairly hostile society to find a way to bring up their children, to battle with the schools about remarks made about their children, to keep alive something that was very special in their own culture. People cried a lot. They were grieving, and I said to them, "Do you understand that you've never really grieved? This is why you're finding it so difficult. You've never cried, you've never grieved for all your losses, and you've never grieved communally. You fought each other about your political views and your different political positions in Chile, but you haven't grieved." So the group started this way. We kept the group going over a period of a year before Pinochet's arrest. And one day a man said that was because Pinochet was arrested in the UK. Because of torture and his regime. Oh yes. And one day a man said, "This is a therapeutic group." He said it. I didn't say it. So one aspect of the process was their grief and saying goodbye to Chile, realizing they would not go back, that there was no place for them there. They knew that they would now be called gringos in Chile, and they wouldn't feel at home there. They didn't feel at home in England either, really. The therapy is always, to me, about reality, and here it was about coming to terms with who they were, what they had, and how to speak to their children. The main problem that the group brought to me were the children. What they often say is, "I live only for the children," and that is dangerous. When Pinochet was arrested in London in 1998, the Chileans were already in a group, but now they mobilized. They had always maintained a community base with a building where they put on Chilean activities, taught their children Spanish, and so forth. Now they formed themselves into a committee with computers and telephones. I managed this situation from a therapeutic point of view by being very open with them. I had known them first when they were on hunger strike, when they had been tortured and needed our help. Instead of being the victims upon whom we called for assistance, they became active in trying to bring Pinochet to justice. The early documentation of their cases became highly significant. If we had not documented the cases of these Chilean exiles when they came to the UK, we would not have been in a position to take part in the legal case against him. The group also knew of people living in other countries who came to us so we could document their cases, and they gathered new information from Chile. Our aim has always been to use whatever advocacy we have based largely on evidence that we have produced. In other words, we do not just speak. We speak only if we have evidence, and we had a good deal of evidence. We had many documented cases of torture, and we had with us people who had been tortured, some of whom I was still working with. I think that sometimes therapists lose the capacity to see their client as a person who has potency and strengths and resilience, and we have to work with that, as well as with victimhood. I had worked a long time with some of the victimhood in this Chilean community, and I saw the possibility of something else. We began to work together, joining with Amnesty International and human rights lawyers in order to provide evidence. The Chilean group was invigorated by this event. Although Pinochet was never brought to full trial, their sense of injustice was alleviated to some extent because they were able to see him appear in a magistrate's court in London to hear the allegations against him. They felt he had been shamed and reduced, and that was very important for them. The whole world and the world's media was speaking and writing about Pinochet's crimes. People do not generally use the word justice, but they did in the Pinochet context because the word justice was being used publicly all over the place. Bring Pinochet to justice, bring the torturers to justice, and it is still being used because torturers are being pursued in Chile. Suddenly, Chilean people who had submerged their feelings in order to survive within family and work settings in the UK began to feel potent. I asked those who felt able to speak if they were prepared to take part in interviews. I think that one has to use people's own sense of advocacy when it's appropriate and if they feel able to do it. You have to be very open with people about what an interview means, though. It has expectations. You want change to come from it, and change does not always come. You have to be very honest, but you're also speaking to people who have been politically active and have not lost their capacity to be realistic and understand the limitations. I accompanied them to all the interviews that took place, CNN, BBC, the World Service. For them, being able to speak to the media was empowering. I was with them during the interviews, and I was interviewed many times myself. It was a difficult thing for them to do. They spoke about their dreams, their shattered dreams and torture, but it was, I'm not keen on the word healing anymore, but it was a healing process for them. This is where the therapeutic aspect came in, because it was upsetting and it brought back many memories and a lot of pain. It was important that we had the time and space to talk about what it was doing to them and to be very open about whether they'd had enough or if they felt what they had done was sufficient. I accompanied the group in the role of therapist and advocate. I've never been able to separate the two because I find that advocacy is part of the therapeutic process. While I dealt with a lot of their tears, their pain and anger, I was also able to accompany them to speak publicly, to go to the House of Lords, and to hear what the results of that were, to go on the streets and see the public interest in the case. By the time Pinochet came to London, a lot of work had been done about the children and about the injustice that they felt within the group. So there had been preparation for Pinochet, and I suppose, I have to be honest, I'm a political activist as well as a therapist. It is a double act which you have to be very careful about, and you have to be very honest about it. In any case, everybody was prepared for the interviews, and the whole group did very well. The dynamics of this group changed after the Pinochet event. Immediately afterwards, there was a sense of realism. They were politically aware enough to know there was not going to be a full trial in the UK, despite enormous efforts. However, they felt something of a victory had been obtained because they had been acknowledged, and now they felt there was a future for justice. Some torturers in Chile had become frightened and had fled south, and there'd also been a subtle change for them. They'd spoken and they'd understood each other better. Now, of course, they have had to return to rather mundane lives, but I do think it was a helpful exercise for them. Much anger and many tears came during our discussions because they'd internalized so much feeling and bitterness. It came out in our group. They were very angry. They cried, they shouted. Some could barely speak with emotion about what had happened all those years ago. Nevertheless, it had great value. So that's just an extract from the paper. I think it's a very unusual way of working for Helen, but it brings out the wider issue of why documentation of survivors' experience is so important, because that is actually a record of what has happened to them. And it does occur to me, because I used to work for Amnesty International in the 90s, and during that period there were plenty of Syrian refugees who had been tortured horrendously, and their cases were documented by Helen, by Amnesty, and various other medical practitioners. And that's very important now, isn't it? As is the going forward in groups of exiles that are so suffering. So I just thought you might find that interesting, so I read that bit. There's also other aspects of the paper that you might find interesting about working with, for example, situations where women have been subjected to gender-based violence and have, as a result, been rejected by their community. We work with that a lot. Most of our work is done within the privacy of very tight-knit legal medical circles and, you know, health care. And so it usually doesn't meet the public eye, but it is very nice to think that those people's torture was acknowledged and heard, and that that made a difference for them. So I'm going to just whip through. This is us. I wanted to give a face to the Helen-Bamber-Foundation because it's usually one of us just talking and it's hard to imagine. This is a staff memorial for staff and clients. It was actually taken at another memorial, a private one, where clients could express their many feelings about Helen passing. Our staff consists of doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, physiotherapists, body-mind therapists, which I find really interesting, which is when you're working intuitively, body and mind together. It's very structured, actually, and not a floaty thing, if I can describe it that way. It's a very structured, interesting way of working to bring body and mind together after torture and violation. Wide networks of other clinicians. We have a lot of friends. We're very lucky. We also run a creative arts program where people make that gradual reintegration towards employment, education, and independent life, but they do it in a very friendly and easy to manage environment. So our clients have a very wide remit. This is why Helen did found the Helen-Bamber-Foundation in 2005, was because she didn't want to keep within the confines of one kind of torture, which is state torture. She wanted to identify people's needs through their entire lives and what they'd been through. And these included the increasing number of victims of human trafficking and modern slavery that we were becoming aware of in the UK, as well as people who have gender-based violence, collective violence, and familial violence backgrounds. And of course, people who are vulnerable, as we know, because they've had human rights violations happen, particularly victims of trafficking and those who've been subjugated for long periods of time, are then vulnerable to further abuse and violence within relationships if they don't get the assistance and help they need. So this is how we defined interpersonal violence in the report that we recently produced with the OSCE on trafficking. And this is basically, in all of the scenarios we deal with, what we're talking about. And many of our clients, unfortunately, have overlapping violations. So a victim of state torture then ends up in the hands of what they imagine are smugglers to get them out of the country, and they end up getting trafficked. And these scenarios, which I'm sure you're all really familiar with in your own work. So from a clinical perspective, we find, or our doctors find, that similar physical and psychological injuries, illnesses and conditions come through all of this spectrum of interpersonal violence, resulting very often in complex, repeated and prolonged trauma. And all of our clinical assessment and documentation of injuries is done in accordance with the Istanbul Protocol Manual, which I expect you're all familiar with. We use that for victims of trafficking as well, and we're currently engaged in a project with the Council of Europe on doing a supplementary protocol which allows for additional considerations in the assessment and documentation of torture suffered by victims of trafficking. This is our hub. This is actually a slide that I used to talk about all the things that I did for a young woman who came to the foundation. This was a while ago, so she's actually had a lot more therapy now. She's been in a therapeutic program which is short-term, which helps to stabilize intrusive symptoms and help victims of trafficking to make decisions and move forward and to understand actually what's happening to them. I'm always really impressed because they're told, you know, this is a panic attack, this is what's happening in your brain, this is not this is not giving you long-term damage when this happens, and they can talk about the symptoms without ever having to talk about their experiences at this early stage. She's now in one-to-one therapy, which is very different and is much more progressively going into what is a very, very complex and difficult history for her, not only in her native country, but in other countries, including the UK. This is my work, part of my work, which is just for clients who've been trafficked. When they are referred to us, they are assessed with a full initial assessment, and we decide whether, as a multidisciplinary team, we decide whether they can go on the list for a medical legal report, whether that's possible for them. And in light of all of that, we always consider what their therapeutic and health needs are. And in the meantime, while they're on waiting lists, contact and safeguarding is really particularly important for these clients who are especially vulnerable to further harm. Although we consider all of our clients like that, but safeguarding and contact is something that we're particularly pushing in the UK and internationally for victims of trafficking specifically, because the level of disappearance can be high, and that's a real problem. This is a report where you can read more about our actual approach to all of our work, not just trafficking. We got in the part 2. We're always doing part 2 of everything when we publish. We're trying for a part 1 if anyone wants to commission it. But this is clinical links between human trafficking and torture, which is actually just a really good handbook on our work and how we approach therapy and how we approach the hierarchy of needs in terms of, what people need to survive. That you can't give therapy to hungry people or people who are frightened of somebody who is threatening their family, or you have to solve all of the problems around it, and that's actually contained in there as well. We recently contributed to the Trafficking Survivor Care Standards, which has been launched in the UK by the independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner for the UK, who's the first of his kind. I'm afraid the role isn't as exciting as the Dutch version, but we're getting there. This is from many organisations who work on the front line in trafficking in the UK, and it just sets standards for healthcare that we would set anyway for our clients, but obviously it's easier at the moment to publish within the realm of trafficking. In there's a paper that I produced with my colleague who's the head of therapies, Katie Robdent, Dr. Katie Robdent. We wrote a thing on how non-clinicians can apply therapeutic principles to their work so that the work is seamless, so that people don't feel like they've come in, they've had a really in-depth therapy session in one way or another, whatever therapy, and then they go to fill out a form with someone else or get housing advice or help, or they get legal referral and someone's dealing with them like they're in an office. So we don't do that because we think it jars things and slows the process of recovery. So we try to make things cohesive, and it's very simple to do. I say that because I can do it, so anyone can do it, and you can do it in any environment, no matter how small or difficult to work in. So we're hoping to spread the word on that, alongside really other good organisations in the UK, like Poppy Project and Tara and all these other organisations that no doubt you've heard, which are all listed in there. And it's under the auspices of the Human Trafficking Foundation, which brings all of these people under one umbrella, which is essential in our very adversarial legal system to deal with. There's a bit of creative survival right there, which is Woven Gold singing. They are quite an amazing group of musicians who work with professional musicians who come into the foundation and sing and do music with them. And that's one of our many creative programs that we run. So that's it, really. I just wanted to introduce it in context so that you had an idea of why we thought that this interview was really important, and why I would really enjoy it if you could read the paper and see what you think. And I was just wondering if you have any questions about any of the issues that I've raised that you'd like to ask about Helen or about the work or anything like that.
Thank you very much, Rachel. First of all,
thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you.
For a very insightful, very personal account of your work and of the work of the Helen-Bamber-Foundation, which in a way yesterday we talked about the large framework, this morning we talked more about sort of structural constraints, and now it seems to me we're really zooming into a very individual perspective and translating many of the things that we discussed in the morning into sort of, well, what does it actually mean if you work with an individual that sits across from you in the room or wherever. So I think it was very, very interesting. I'm sure there are a number of questions. I see the first already here.
Yeah, so thanks very much for this very touching talk. Your main example was a group of torture victims from Chile, and this leads me to a contested question, actually, group therapy for trauma. I know that there are some opponents to it and some favor it, and it seems to me a very urgent topic now in Germany, because we just had last week a statement by the German Psychotherapists Association that every trauma victim needs individual psychotherapy, and I know from my university town in Aachen that the waiting list for it is already 1.5 years, and that was before the massive influx, so it now will be certainly several years. So my question really is, what are your experience, your views? Can it be responsible to offer trauma therapy in a group, or is there the risk of re-traumatizing people by listening to the reports of others higher that needs the group to be somehow homogeneous? So what are your views on it?
Well, firstly, I have to say I'm not a therapist, so I don't have qualified views on this. My colleagues do, and I'm really happy to put you in contact with them if you have any questions that you'd like to ask them, because we're a very big team. But in the actual core set, we have a very small team of therapists who work very closely together on making sure that we have the right ethos and we believe in what we're doing. I can tell you from my experience what I see and observe. what I see at the Helen-Bamber-Foundation is that we've started a new program, a relatively new program, where our therapists who are clinical psychologists run small, very small groups for people who have suffered trafficking. And those groups are absolutely steer clear of any discussion of past events at all. So nobody ever is asked what happened to you. The whole reason that we do that, and they will explain it much more eloquently than me, but the reason we do that from my point of view, because I'm involved in their recovery, is, and safeguarding, is to make sure that they are coping with the immediate symptoms they have. Some of them might suffer flashbacks and very intrusive panic attacks. And, you know, I see people at the very raw end when they come in. So stabilizing in that way is short term, but it's not the end of it. And we don't generally give, I mean, this changes all the time because we have a team that are discussing it all the time, but we don't generally give group therapy without one-to-one therapy being offered as well. So it would be very unusual for someone just to attend a group and never to attend group therapy. We have problems with waiting lists. We have problems with resources. We're a tiny charity. So I know that's going to be a big problem. I think the real issue that I see from people who are having what they call counselling in the UK, they will come to me and I will go through a very detailed needs assessment with them, and they will be, as far as I can see, quite traumatised by going over and over chronologically what's happened again and again, and then leaving and having real dissociating or having really quite dangerous for them reactions to it. And I think it's hard to judge. What it's about really is there's no one size fits all. And what governments tend to do is say, I need you to go through that process so that I know where you're at and I can sort you out. And it's so individual, isn't it? I think there are certain individuals that don't want therapy. We work with them anyway. I have clients who will not engage in therapy. They're too frightened of it or they're not ready, and that's fine with us. So I do think it's very individual. But on the other hand, it's, yeah, I'd like my colleagues to be here to answer it. But I understand your concerns, absolutely. And I think it's important at this time when you've got this big group of people coming in who are likely to be put into group scenarios, that it's just done really, really well and really with thought for their entire individual history. Some people really don't want to sit in a group and their trauma, their background to be considered a lumpen sort of situation with others. Do you know what I mean? They don't want that. So we don't do that in groups. In our groups, that's not the place where we discuss what's happened. Does that answer it? Okay.
Hi, Rachel. My name's Claire Broll and I'm from the School of Public Health at the University of Queensland in Australia. And I just really wanted to say thank you so much for coming here today and giving us your talk.
Oh, thank you.
One of my very early jobs was working in law as a refugee lawyer in the United Kingdom. And I really just cannot emphasise and reinforce enough about what you're stating around the importance of medical doctors as advocates for their clients. I know that all the clients that we were successful in getting political asylum before the Immigration Appeal Tribunal, like that's what it was called at that time, I don't know if that's still the phrase, all of them had medico-legal reports, because otherwise without them, you know, clients were considered before the courts as inconsistent, unreliable, lying, and it was, you know, and people who experience torture, they're not consistent.
No,
the past, the present, it all intermingles into one. The Home Office would say, well, you've said in your statement you were subjected to torture 5 times, but here in the court you're saying you were subjected to torture 8 times. So what is it, 5 or 8? And you're clearly lying because you can't get it right. So, you know, if we didn't have a medico-legal report confirming PTSD and severe depression, or another report confirming there was an acquired brain injury because an individual had been kicked in the head by a gendarme, or a report from a forensic medical specialist saying, yes, the scarring on this individual's back is consistent with what melted plastic would look like on a person's skin. You know, what these doctors do is so incredible and so important. And I would also like to sort of flip it around, that sometimes I felt a bit like a clinician as well. I'm in no way a clinician, but I was the first person that these people saw after these incredible and often horrendous experiences, and I had to take their stories and, and having to extract their stories very carefully and trying to put it in some sort of chronological order and doing that with enormous sensitivity and identifying, yes, this particular individual needs you know, psychotherapy and psychological support. So
it's a tricky one. I think the only answer
I never saw myself as a clinician, but what I'm suggesting is that, you know, you had to be very careful the way you were framing your questions to get the information from these people, to ensure that the statement you gave to the Home Office at that very first point of entry was the best that it could possibly be.
Yeah, I hear your stress. I know what you mean. In England, it's very adversarial, and to be honest, when we win, we like it, because we think, well, we've got a system there, and we argued it to the end. But actually, when we lose, which is all the time, well, actually, I guess we don't lose because we persevere, but, you know, it is a very, very, very adversarial system, and they will go right to whether it was tea or coffee at the time when, you know, it's literally that silly sometimes. You know, there's been all sorts of travesties in refusal letters, and there still are. We just have to keep the door sort of wedged open with arguments against that approach. And we have a medical team at Amnesty, at Helen-Bamber, very small, that is just there to make sure that our reports are all court standard, that all the rules, that there's no gaps. We're always looking at the other side. And I remember when I worked for Amnesty, the researchers in the research teams were not used to this adversarial level. They were like, well, if I say this person's been tortured in this prison, what's the problem? And for the UK, you know, you'd say, oh, yes, but that was when they were in that country. Now they're in the UK, they want to stay here. You're going to have to argue this. You're going to have to explain this. They've come back and said this. And it gets much, much more detailed. And it's tricky to work with. But I feel like, feeling positively, it's better than having no system. We do have recorded decisions why people are refused asylum. And sometimes the sillier or more unjustified they are, the better. Because then we can get a good lawyer and argue it. But yes, it's a very difficult system, and I'm sure it's hugely costly, actually, especially when there are sometimes medical reports that aren't necessary. They shouldn't be necessary, and the person shouldn't have to undergo that. So there's, you know, lots of sides to it.
I'd like to say thank you for the lovely presentation. My name is Boris Kalova. I come from the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität of Erlangen-Nürnberg. I am part of the MA program in human rights. I was really, really excited to see an NGO approach, as I also come from an NGO background. I did a lot of human rights activism, and also in the 90s, the late 90s, early 2000s, I was among the people who established the first within youth work anti-trafficking networks. So we established Euro-Mediterranean network for human trafficking prevention, and then some of them in Eastern Europe, perhaps not very famous to the people here. But what I would like to ask very specifically, as it is really part of my activism experience, is how do you exactly ensure that the huge efforts you make in rehabilitation for the human trafficking victims are actually not falling apart once they go away from the safe environment you provide for them? Because what we are experiencing both in Eastern Europe as well as in the European and North African Mediterranean is a very low integration rate of the victims. The process of reintegration is so painful and so problematic that sometimes it happens that the efforts of the NGOs just stay there, and once the victim has to go away to try to reintegrate, it all goes away as an effect, because communities and institutions don't seem to be ready.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and we're quite unique in the maybe idealistic way that we don't say goodbye to clients in quite the way that other organisations do. But to be honest, there's a very strong sense of trust, because people will leave when they want to. And I think, in my experience of working in this way, when people know that the door is open if they need you again, and they can make that phone call and come back, or they can ask for a particular help, they'll do it. But it gets less and less frequent, and then they become more and more sort of part of the community, or even come back to help or teach or something like that. We believe in sustained recovery. We thought long and hard about that term when we were writing the trafficking report that I showed you, the red one. Sustaining recovery allows for the fact that you can't take a snapshot image of someone's recovery at a certain time and say, oh, that's it then, they've come this far, because the trajectory is not predictable. So you have setbacks, you have vast fluctuations at times, and you have periods of stasis that just seem to go on and on without any kind of level change. And this is something that we argue for a lot. So we don't actually have these, when I was talking about the short-term therapy, that's a stabilization process. That isn't actually saying, well, I'm going to give you this many weeks. It is a difficult balance, because it means that you're looking at every individual very, very carefully, and it also means that waiting lists are long and resources are tight, but we all work with that. But I agree with you. I know people who've had really good results in their 18 weeks of trauma-focused therapy or whatever they have outside of our foundation, but then they can get quite desperate. There can be quite a massive anticlimax. And also, when people get refused asylum and they get a horrible letter saying you're a liar and you're an economic migrant, and you know, they say horrible things like you've embroidered the story, it's a tapestry. You get a lot of weaving and knitting sort of similes in some of them. It's very upsetting, it's very distressing for them, and they can go down. But similarly, and strangely to some minds, it can happen when they get the refugee status they've waited for. They get that safety, they have a massive anticlimax feeling, or they get overly relieved and suddenly they can't cope, or it all just comes back to them, do you know what I mean, and symptoms start again. So monitoring them through the very lengthy, often legal process in the UK is something that we do. We don't really lose touch with people, but they do lose touch with us. It's a difficult thing to explain, and I wouldn't have understood it till I came and saw the work, or actually did the work, which I do now. I just, like, for example, I feel that once somebody is stabilized and they've had therapeutic care and they know the door isn't actually shut, they will go off. They want to make their own lives and community. They will, but they can have assistance to do that. One of the things I think is most important in our creative arts program, where we have classes for English, computer classes, art classes, and all of these other activities, people are working in a room with other vulnerable people, and they know that no one is going to ask them about their background. And this is something that, particularly with people who've been sexually violated, raped, abused, trafficked, and tortured sexually, they get so distressed about sitting in a normal educational institution and being asked that question. You know, oh, you're from Albania. Oh, you're from China. Tell us about why you're here. Well, you know, what about your family? These questions, they actually can get avoidant about going in. So it's a sort of stage, it's a gradual progression. And I think if you don't take the time with it, it can backfire. It can lose all the investment. But I also think you have to trust people to get up off, you know, to do as much as they can for themselves with the support that they need. Does that make sense? It's a tricky one to explain, but I think it works. It's explained more in the report that I showed you, the red one, which we did with the OSCE.
Thank you. I saw two further questions. Yes, over here and over here. I think we'll take them together, and because I don't want to limit the lunchtime too much.
Yeah, Till Meissner, thank you for your talk. I'm a systemic therapist and working with refugees. So I want to answer just shortly to your question about whether it's possible to do trauma therapy in a group or not. I think you would probably